right. Good afternoon. My name's John Halbrook, and I'm here to talk about radios. What radio should I buy has become the latest question in the overlanding, off-roading, vehicle, outdoor adventure world. And there's a lot of options out there. But nobody knows where to start. Nobody knows really what is involved to get started, and nobody knows what the rules and policies are around all these different radio systems. So we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so, and we're going to talk about radio systems. We're going to talk about what you can buy off the shelf, what are the rules you need to know associated with those radios, and how you can implement them effectively with your group so you can have a fun time and communicate while you're outdoors. All right, so a bit of an introduction. My name is John Halbrook. I'm an outdoor enthusiast here in central Iowa. I live in Des Moines. I take my family on minor adventures wherever we can. We camp, we hike, we travel together, and it's a lot of fun. And radios become a part of that conversation. Effective communication is a big part of that. In my professional world, I work in emergency response. I'm a paramedic and I've served as a firefighter. And radios are a part of that culture. So it makes sense that we would use radios in our everyday world. So I spent some time, I researched the options, I shared some information, gave this presentation a couple of times, and a group of us decided, we should probably record it and make a video and make it available to a broader audience. So here goes. So the first thing you need to understand is that there's a certain number of regulations tied to radio. The Code of Federal Regulations, specifically CFR 47, covers a lot of what radio systems are organized. We can start with Part 80. Part 80 of 47 CFR manages the maritime mobile radio service. So those are the boats on ships. The classic ship-to-shore marine radio is regulated under that part of law. Part 90 covers business and industrial pool and private radios. That's going to be important down the road as we talk about different radio systems. Part 95 governs CB, Citizens Band Radio, which we all remember from our favorite 1970s TV shows and movies. It also governs the Family Radio Service, or FRS radios. Those are the small, low-power blister pack radios that we hand to kids at campsites and run around and say, don't get in trouble. A step from there is the General Mobile Radio Service, or GMRS. Within Part 95 is also the multi-use radio service, or MURS, M-U-R-S. And last but not least is Part 97. Part 97 governs the amateur radio service. So for our talk today, we're going to talk about Part 90, Part 95, and Part 97. Those are the three rule sets that are important. And you need to be aware that each of those rule sets has their own requirements, has their own mandates, and has their own use cases for those radios. So, how can we be legal then, if we've got all these rules and all these pieces and all these sets? Well, I break it down into three categories. In order to be legal on the radio, one, you have to have a radio that's certified. The radio has to be legal to operate within that rule set. The second piece is that the operator has to be licensed. They have to carry the appropriate license to use that radio space. And the third piece is you have to be coordinated. You have to understand that you're a part of a larger radio community with a larger radio system. So let's break them down and let's see how each of those pieces fit within our understanding of radios. The first one we're going to talk about is CB radios. CBs are Citizens Band radios. We get 40 channels. Those 40 channels live between 26.965 megahertz and 27.465 megahertz. In that frequency spread, we get some neat effects from the atmosphere, where you can deal with skip and bounce across the atmosphere. But you also deal with a little lesser audio quality, depending on how you have that radio set up. So generally speaking, CBs are considered short-range communication. They're allowed for business and individual use, and there's no license required. So this is one of the easiest radios to get into. If I buy the radio, I'm good. I don't have to have a license. I don't have to have additional coordination or special dialogue. I just get to key the microphone and get to talking on the radio. That's great. It makes it for easy to use, but it also has led to an environment where there's a whole lot of people saying a whole lot of stuff on the radio, and it might be challenging for you to find the space in the environment that you want to work in. The second radio we're going to talk about is the FRS GMRS radio. So FRS is Family Radio Service and GMRS is General Mobile Radio Service. Family Radio Service, FRS, requires no license. They're short range, simple equipment. You buy the blister pack from the big box store and you're ready to go. They're low power and there's no external antennas allowed. So you get what you get out of the box with those radios. The General Mobile Radio Service, GMRS, has a license tied to it. So for a $70 one-time fee, you can get a 10-year family license. That $70 allows anyone in your family to operate on the GMRS radio. Under GMRS, you can have radios as big as 50 watts, and you can have external antennas, which all comes into play when we talk about range, which one works better distance-wise. So, with our model, the radios are certified, FRS and GMRS radios are certified, the operator is licensed, and we don't have to worry about coordination. So if we buy the radio for FRS, we're good. If we buy the radio for GMRS and we pay for a license fee, we're good there as well. The next radio system we're going to talk about is MURS, the multi-use radio service. MURS is interesting. It lives in the VHF 2-meter band, roughly, and it exists in 5 channelized frequencies between 151 and 154 megahertz. If you've been around radios for a while, these are the old gold dot, purple dot, green dot radios. You can still get access to them, you can still use them, and they're pretty functional. You're limited to 2 watts of output power with these radios, but you can have external antennas. So in this case, the radio is licensed, the radio is certified, you don't need a license and you don't need a coordinator. So those are easy to use, easy to get into. The next conversation is industrial business pool, private land mobile radios. This is sort of the biggest lift of all the radios. In these radio circumstances, you buy a chunk of frequency space and you make an agreement with the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and say, I'm going to talk on these radios at this location at this time, and the FCC reviews that. In order to talk on those frequencies with those radios, you got to have radios that are Part 90 approved, you got to have a license to be able to use the frequency, and you have to be coordinated so that you're not messing up other people's space on the radio. This will become really important later as we talk about how we use radio space. The last one we're going to talk about today is the amateur radio service. Amateur radio service requires a license. You got to take a knowledge test and pass it to get your amateur radio license. But with the amateur radio license comes a broad array of authorities and privileges. You can talk with a lot of power, with a lot of antenna, and you can even build your own radios, so there's no certification on the radios you're using. But because you're licensed and you're responsible, it's up to you to be coordinated and be responsible with the radio spectrum that you're using. So this little graphic shows some common ground, where FRS and CB are really easy to use and easy to buy into and easy to organize. GMRS and amateur radios and even the private business band radios require more coordination and more licensing to get into. With all that being said, there's an important disclaimer. Emergencies trump all. If there's a life safety issue that can be addressed or helped by the use of radio communications, the FCC has a nice waiver in place that says if you need to talk on a radio that you don't have approval for, and you're trying to, in good faith, to save somebody's life, you can do that. Now, that should not be your basis for all radio communications, but it is available in case you need it. All right, so now we've talked about radio systems, we've talked about some of the rules and laws. Let's talk a little bit about band plans. Band plans are the idea that the channels and frequencies are organized. that we shouldn't just go out and grab a piece of radio spectrum and say, hey, my group of 20 people we're going to talk here today. We got to know what's organized. Basically, all of our frequencies and all of our airspace is assigned to somebody somewhere. And it's really easy for us to drive down the road and say, well, I didn't hear anything, so I'm good. And I'll tell you that there's a lot of systems that you can't hear that are still working, and there's a lot of folks listening because they own that spectrum and it's important for them. So just like walking down a trail or riding down a dirt road, we want to be good stewards of the environment we're in. We want to be good stewards of the radio spectrum we're using, and we want to work through that. So I'll give you a couple of examples of things we've dealt with. One is the frequency 151.625. I've seen this programmed in on a number of radios in the community I work with over the last few years, and I want to share some information about it. Folks that are running that frequency need to know that there are 2,701 licensed users of that frequency. That's a lot of people that rely on that frequency. If you're using that and you're not coordinated with those other users, or you don't have the FCC license to operate on that frequency, you probably shouldn't be talking on it. Another frequency is 154.980 megahertz. This is common in a lot of radios that we're seeing programmed in our community, and this is challenging as well. This is a public safety frequency. There's 844 licensed users across the country on this frequency, and locally here, there's at least one fire department and one public works office that rely on that frequency for their use. So if we've got a group of folks in trucks and Jeeps driving around and they decide, you know what, this is the frequency we're going to work on, we could cause problems for public safety response. CB radios even have their own frequency organization. If you've been around the CB world long enough, you understand that channel 9 is an emergency channel and channel 19 is a highway channel. That mentality, that order and organization from chaos is what's important in this conversation. The GMRS and FRS world has a little bit less formal structure and organization, except for understanding that under the current organization of those frequencies, there's shared spectrum. So if you have an FRS radio and a GMRS radio, there are certain channels that overlap with each other. This is incredibly powerful. If we've got 3 trucks that all have GMRS radios in their truck and 3 trucks that don't, we can hand some FRS radios out and we can find some common ground to work on and talk through. Within the FRS GMRS community, the idea of a calling channel has come up, and a lot of folks are advocating that if we go to channel 1, that's where you should sit and hang out if you're not organized and efficiently working with anybody currently. Within the amateur radio community, there's a ton of radio spectrum. There's a ton of organization. This shows the 2 meter 440 or 70 centimeters band and how it's organized within the amateur community. And here's an example of a band plan within that space. So if you've got a radio that's designed and built for amateur radio use, make sure you're not squatting or sitting on frequency space that's intended for another purpose or another use. An example I like to use here is frequency that's dedicated for satellite communication. There's a whole subset of the amateur radio hobby that's about talking to satellites. So just because there's no one around you and you don't hear anything and you might not see traffic regularly on that frequency, it doesn't mean that you're not interfering with someone else's attempts to communicate. So be aware of those band plans, be aware of that spectrum as it moves around. One of the more active communities in the outdoor overland vehicle space is the overland bound community. Their forum has some great guidance and great discussions on these topics. Within their group, they came forward with the idea of using 146.46 as an off-road calling frequency in the amateur radio band, or channel 15 in the FRS GMRS space, or channel 16 in the citizens band space. Some considerations that our community, our local group is considering is the idea that FRS and GMRS can be used on channel 1 for calling. The amateur radio calling on 146.52 could be used. 146.460 in this area, in this neck of the woods, is used in a couple of repeaters. So if you're going to use that frequency, make sure you're coordinated and you're not interfering with repeater traffic. So the important lesson here is that if you're going to use radios and you're going to interact with your community and you're going to share information, you got to find common ground. Where can we all communicate together? If half your group is on CB and the other half is on FRS or GMRS and you've got a couple more outliers on amateur radio, you're never going to be able to communicate together. So gather friends, gather colleagues, gather friends together, have some real conversations about radios. What are we going to use? Where are we going to communicate? Why are we trying to do this? And find common ground to fall on. One of the groups in central Iowa was all over the map, and we started having these conversations, and we're seeing more and more folks gravitate towards that GMRS radio. They like the audio capability and they like the flexibility of it. This brings us to the question of how much range can I get? Everybody wants to know how far these radios will work. And that's a tough conversation because there's a lot of variables. Everything from time of day to whether or not trees have leaves on them and the condition of the atmosphere determines that variable. But some basic bullet points to consider are listed here. 1, more power equals more range. If you want to talk further, you got to have more power, so keep that in mind. External antennas are always better than fixed antennas. If you're holding a handheld radio inside your truck, you're hardly ever going to perform as well as the vehicle-mounted external antenna. And physics beats all of us every time. If there's a giant granite mountain between me and the person I'm trying to talk to, that's tough to talk around with a lot of these systems. So obstacles, weather, atmosphere, all come into play when we talk about range. So take those variables into consideration, work through those processes, and find a common ground to work on. When you start a trip or start a group outing, have a conversation about radios. Have that be a part of your safety brief, along with figuring out who's got recovery gear or who's got first aid equipment. Find out what radios are available. Figure that out, find the common frequencies, designate folks who can go make emergency calls and emergency decisions if needed. And that's it. That sums up our radio talk. Figure out the rules, figure out the space, buy the radios that are right for you and your group, and enjoy the outdoors and be safe. Thanks a lot.